I'm not a person who ever thought I was going to disrupt everything. I was probably the person that the kindergarten teacher, first grade teacher told my parents, this person is too disruptive. So I was disruptive in that sense, but nobody thought I was going to be a disruptive business leader, and I certainly didn't either. And when I started my company, which is a private equity firm, I didn't really think of I was disrupting the world or disrupting the private equity industry. And most people who start companies and ultimately wind up disrupting other companies don't think they're disruptive. They don't think so because they think their business is going to be relatively small. None of these people think their business is going to be that big in the beginning. In my case, I started a private equity firm in Washington, D.C., a place where there were no private equity firms, so nobody paid attention. Everybody laughed. Why would you do this in Washington? It's a government city. And so private equity was a business known as buyouts or venture capital to all of you. And that's a business where historically you got very high rates of return and you got high compensation for that. The industry started in the 1960s and 1970s with venture capital in the 60s and buyouts in the 70s. And the people that came along, they came along to do this, and they said to their investors, well, we're going to do something that's never been done before. We're going to build companies. We're going to change companies dramatically. We're going to sit on the boards of companies, but it's a long-term process, and we're going to work really hard. And, well, we just don't want to be compensated the way people who are compensated who run mutual funds. So we want to get a big piece of the profits. And it was agreed more or less at the beginning that 20% of the profits would go to these people who are doing the buyouts or venture capital. That was a gigantic change in the way people were compensated who manage money for other people. 20% of the profits, and they convinced people to give them the money for 10 years or so. So they were in a long-term relationship, and you got paid a fee for managing other people's money, even if you didn't invest it. Just for their committing to give you money, you were able to charge them a fee on committed capital. You got 20% of the profits, and you held on to money for a long time. Well, that was the basic business. When I came along, I came up with two ideas with my partners that disrupted the private equity world. We didn't change the economic formula that I just mentioned, but historically in private equity, you had a business which did one thing, you're allowed to have one business at a time. If the partnership agreement said if you have a buyout fund, you have to spend 100% of your time on buyouts. If you're a venture fund, you have to spend 100% of your time on venture. So the concept never really took hold that these businesses could be very big. So the leading firms in venture capital or buyouts particularly, they were very small firms. When KKR did the famous RJR deal in 1989, they had about 7 investment people. That's because the partnership agreement said, if you're managing my money in this way, you can't do anything else. I decided with my partners to ignore that. I decided it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission, so rather than go to my investors and say, I'm going to do something else, I just decided to do it. And sometimes when you're disrupting, you have to do that. So I decided what I would do is do what Fidelity had done or others had done in mutual fund business. I would change the business by having multiple funds. Instead of just having a buyout fund, I'd have a venture fund, a growth capital fund, a real estate fund, multiple funds, institutionalizing the business by having such a big presence, and therefore make us institutional and not just a small mom and pop. Now that doesn't sound revolutionary to you, but it changed the face of private equity because the larger firms basically did the same thing, are now doing the same thing. These large private equity firms have disrupted these smaller firms by being very, very large. And then the second thing we did is we globalized it. Historically, people who invested in buyouts or venture capital did it only in their own industry, and they didn't do it around the world, and we globalized it. So now, having disrupted the industry with others, I now face this dilemma. I'm at the top, and I can be disrupted. So here's a question I'd like to ask you. Right now, I get 20% of the profits, more or less, on other people's money, assume above a certain preferred return and so forth. Now people come along and say, well, geez, you know, we have a lot of money. We have enormous amounts of money. We're a sovereign wealth fund. We have so much money, but we're going to give you enormous sums of money, but we don't really think you should get 20% of the profits because we're giving you so much money. So why don't we do this? Why don't we give you a very large sum, more than anybody has ever given you, but we'll only give you 10% of the profits. So you could say, okay, I could take this large sum of money and get only 10% of the profits, not 20%. Maybe I'll work as hard, maybe I'll make a lot of money, but am I disrupting myself by doing that? Because if I do that, will people who are paying me 20% say, well, I'm not going to do that anymore? So I'm going to ask people here, if you were in my position and somebody came along and said, I'll give you many billions of dollars and I want you to invest in it, but I'm only going to pay you because it's such a large sum, 10% of the profits, would you be willing to take the risk that you won't disrupt your existing business and take the money because you're afraid somebody else will get it, or because you're afraid that, you know, if you don't take it, these investors will never do anything with you again? How many people would take the 10% money? How many people would be afraid you would disrupt your business? Okay. What? Sliding scale. You could do that as well. That's a possibility, and maybe we'll do that. Well, let me ask you another question. Right now, people say to me, I'm paying you money even if you're not investing it. It's committed, and you can call it down over 5 years, but you may not call it down. And so I'm paying you a fee for just holding my money, but I'm holding the money. You haven't even taken it yet. So suppose somebody comes along, as people are now doing, and say, I'll tell you what, I'll pay you a nice fee, but only on the capital that you invest. No more fee on committed capital. So how many people here would say, okay, I'd be afraid that if I do that, all my investors will say the same thing and they won't pay a fee on committed capital, I will have disrupted my own business, or be afraid that if you don't take the money, your peers will take it and they will get the closer relationships with their investors. How many people would take the money, no matter what the terms are, just to have the money, even if they're not getting a fee on committed capital? Anybody would do that? How many people are you afraid you disrupt your business? Okay, I don't know what the right answer is. I'll tell you someday. Okay, so this is going on in every business. Every business, every day, you might be disrupted. You might find somebody coming along, and you have to face the dilemma that one day you're a disruptor, but inevitably, if you're very successful a disruptor, you're likely to be disrupted by somebody else. And most businesses at the top do get disrupted. It's very difficult to be nimble at the top and avoid being disrupted.